make sure my volume is up. It's great to have you all here this evening. I'm really excited about today's conversation and also just pulling people together in different settings. It's fun to see some jazz in the background as I'm kind of grooving in through Kenny G right there. There we go. That actually could have been nice. It would have set a different vibe for today's conversation. But as a quick introduction, my name is Peter Baumgarten. I'm a faculty member in the business school, obviously, have worked with the executive MBA program now for the last almost 5 years. EMBA 52 was my first cohort, which means in a short bit I didn't have either of these two in my own classes, but I've had several of you in classes over the years. I am the director of the Koch Center for Family Enterprise, which hits everything from family business to family office to family foundation, but also have been one of the leaders, along with Bart Hamilton, of the touch points between healthcare and business, which is why I'm here this evening. In addition to, this is a great way to get an hour and a half free from my 2.5-year-old son, who's probably destroying the house at this point. Sorry, Kelly. But importantly, this is the second out of 3 events. The first one, which happened a little bit ago already, some of you may have attended, that is about this year of celebration of EMBA. This is the second one, and then the big one happens on September 22nd and 23rd. So my hope is that you're able to join us in City Park if you're an EMBA alum or current student, to be able to celebrate that program, to meet with one another. I was chatting with Marcus just a bit ago, and I think we're over 200 or so registered for that event, and should be just a really fantastic event in a fantastic space. But today's event is essentially focused on some of the healthcare overlaps with EMBA. So if the first one is around career pivots, today is actually hitting a segment that addresses many of our EMBA cohort. So in our EMBA cohort this last time through of our graduates, it was probably 20 to 25% had some sort of healthcare overlap, whether they were physicians that were at the hospital, whether they were leaders at several large organizations here in town, amongst other things. There's a lot of interest in overlap in healthcare. And in a lot of ways, this is a central strategy, I would think, for Olin moving forward, is you've got one of the top medical schools, a top business school, and a really robust ecosystem of healthcare in the region. And so having these types of events where we can pull together alum, current students, I have some of our current MD, MBA students here in the room as well, to think about these touch points, I think is a fantastic opportunity. They're pleased about the fact they referenced them in the introduction. But should be a great conversation, centrally tied towards questions of integration in healthcare, integration, acquisition, M&A. So even if you're not coming from the space of healthcare, I think there's going to be quite a bit of overlap with the worlds of, again, private equity rolling up certain clinics, pulling together certain businesses inside and outside of healthcare, a lot of residents. So for today, I have the honor of welcoming our 2 guests here. EMBA 38 and EMBA 8, Sandra and Ken. So why don't the 2 of them come forward? I'll hit a few quick points of bio. Their bios are both really long, which is probably a sign of insecurity that they had to make really long true. Bios. But
it's longer than his.
That's true. That's probably more for accomplishment's sake than insecurity. But the bios are robust, both at the touch points of healthcare and business and the overlap on the 2. So I'll just hit a few of them. Ken, I'll start with you. Ken was at Centene for 7 years as an executive vice president and chief medical officer of Centene until June of 2022. Prior to that, he was the Sam and Marilyn Fox Distinguished Professor of Medicine at WashU. And while at Centene, relevant for this work, he was involved in all aspects of business operations, including health plan operation, national new business opportunities, international business acquisitions, and medical strategy. Centene is a small little healthcare startup in town just up the road that has 17 buildings in Clayton. So really great experience there. Unfortunately, we lost him to Chicago, so he is now at Northwestern, but just up the road. So really grateful for Ken for coming back into town.
Yeah, thank
Everyone else, welcome Ken.
Honored to be here. Thank you.
Sandra Van Treese served as the group president of BJC Healthcare, the largest healthcare institution in the St. Louis area, from 2004 until July 2020. The president was the president and chief executive officer at Unicare, an operating unit of WellPoint, a health insurance company. So experience on the provider as well as the payer side The bio goes on from there, but currently does quite a bit of work consulting with healthcare organizations, is also the director of organizations in town, including Drury Development Corporation, a member of their audit committee, amongst other things. So I could keep going on from Drury to Quick Trip. Really some great experience, both in the directorship role, the leadership role, healthcare and non-healthcare. Sandra, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So I want to start by breaking down the bios, not centrally in terms of what I read on a page, but through the eyes of touch points on our broader topic of integration, mergers and acquisition. When you think about your respective positions and experience and the touch points there, where have been those central points of overlap? So Sandra, why don't you kick us off with that? When you think about the topic in your own bio, what are the points where you've seen this across your career?
Thanks, Peter. Again, thank you all for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. You know, it's been part and parcel of my career journey in the healthcare space, which I didn't start in healthcare per se, came to it out of school about 12 years post, but spent the last 26, 27 years in the space, as Peter said, either on the payer side or provider. And one of the striking things about the conversations, regardless of which of those periods, segments of my career, we were always talking about some form of integration. Whether you're on the insurance side, managing ostensibly the risk associated with healthcare, or on the provider side, where you're managing the actual clinical, working with the physicians and managing the clinical side. The key point here is the more visibility, the more transparency, and the more connectivity you have, ostensibly, the better the outcome. And so a lot of the work throughout, again, either that payer side was about getting closer to the provider, or on the provider side, it was about getting closer to the payer. And then fill in the gaps around other integration opportunities that facilitated that, because the organizations I worked with were fairly large and certainly didn't have all the needed expertise in order to make components of that integration happen.
Great. Ken, what about for you? Where did you see it in your own, or see it currently in your own work and career?
Yeah, so my background relevant to this is, so first of all, I just want to say at the get-go, I'm not an M&A person. So if you get into the finances of it, I'm not even the person who knows enough to be dangerous. I'm just dangerous. And my background is more that I was privileged to be part of Centene on the executive management team, partner team during a time of incredible growth. It was about a $20 billion company when I started. It was about 130 when I left.
And that was over what period of time, that growth?
That was over 7 years. So it was pretty amazing. I started in 2015, and one of the things Michael Neidorff said to me is, we will be a $100 billion company in 5 years, and he just hit it exactly on the nose. He was really a visionary. And a lot of that growth was not organic. It was through M&A. And a lot of it was related to companies that had a clinical value proposition. So I had to do some of the due diligence about, whether what they proposed or to give us or add to Centene was of value from there. And I was also there during a time where we acquired or merged with some very substantial companies like HealthNet in California, WellCare in Florida, Fidelis in New York. And then as a chief medical officer, I probably saw a sales pitch from a new startup or a small company. It could have been every day if if the filters allowed it, but the filters being what they needed to be probably was every other week. So I saw what a lot of companies were offering during that time. And then finally, after retiring from Centene, I've been involved with a variety, about 5 different startup companies. So now I'm on the other side trying to help give pitches and stuff. It's kind of interesting. So I've had a little bit of this and that, and I guess my lens would be mostly that on the MD side more than the business side, which is pretty darn important for these things.
Great. So I want to take two different types of integrations. We're going to break it down a couple different ways, but I want to just start by talking about integrations coming together in the payer side and integrations coming together in the provider side. And so, Ken, I'll have you actually start with the payer side. And then Sandra, I want you to come in with the provider side. And in particular, what I want to hear is, what is the value proposition there? So why is this pitched to make sense? And then a follow-up question is, does it deliver on that value proposition? So Ken, payer side, what's the case for integration across these different insurance groups? And does it actually deliver the value that it's anticipated to?
So just like any business, it's not one example. There's many different reasons why there's M&A activity. One big thing that Michael talked about from the get-go when I joined and when it was a $20 billion company was scale. So scale is extraordinarily important on the payer side. It's generally important in healthcare, and that's not really a revelation. You see companies constantly trying to get better and bigger. But on the payer side, you are essentially capitated. You have a certain amount of revenue from your members, and if you can take care of them within a certain smaller than that number, you make a little bit of profit. And if it takes more than that to take care of your members, you don't have a profit. And that profit margin on the payer side, if you're in government-sponsored healthcare like Centene, is not very much. It's only a couple percent, 3%, 2% post-tax. And so if you're a small company and you have a bad year, you have a couple people that are really sick and have ginormous costs, it could really put you under. And if you have a lot of scale, you can weather those things more. So it's very important to have scale, and it's also important to be a player with the government in terms of contracts and RFPs to have that. So a large part of what we saw was to get us to a size where we were kind of that aircraft carrier moving down. It was very hard to move us. So there's that. I had talked to you before, Peter, about the fact that the biggest cost of a payer is taking care of people. So if you can take care of people for a little bit less cost. So for instance, when Centene was a $130 billion company, 87% or so this is all public information, 87% is going into taking care of people. That's about $100 billion of medical expenses per year. If you made a 1% difference in the cost of care, that's a $1 billion drop to the bottom line. The numbers are so big. And so the margins are small, but the actual dollar amount they represent is very, very large. And so, we were always searching for better ways to take care of our patients. There's a lot of waste, a lot of non-value added parts to healthcare, and there's a lot of companies that say they can make a dent in that. And if you can save some money and keep people healthier, then we were very interested. So there's a lot of M&A activity about companies that potentially could help us with that. There was some M&A activity related to operational things, help us with communicating with our members better through texting or cell phones or whatever. There's a lot of electronic capabilities we looked into and stuff like that. But I think at least I'm biased, but a lot of it was related to how to take care of people better.
So one follow-up question there, and then Sandra, will go to you on the provider side. So are the benefits to scale significantly distinct when you were sitting with Michael at a $20 billion company side and he was talking about this 100, versus imagine if we had Sarah London sitting here and she's at 130, 140 and talking about getting to 180? Or so in other words, is there diminishing returns to scale at a certain point, or is the benefit of scale still significant even at Centene size now? of added scale?
So I don't know the answer to that. I would say that at a certain point, and Centene is pretty close to it, you cannot get more horizontal scale. I mean, you're starting to get to the place where it is actually at the place where federal objections will intervene, and you're not going to do a whole lot. So it'll be a different kind of scale for sure at this point. But there are, we were at a very large size, let's say for Medicaid, but there's still a lot that we could do in Medicare Advantage, for instance, and more we could do in ACA. So there are more focused ways to look at that, and you have to be more clever about how you look at M&A activity. It wasn't quite the blue ocean that it was for Michael. So I'm sure it's extremely different for Sarah London. But the overall question about, do you need to get larger? Do you want to be bigger? Well, CVS was pretty big, and they became twice as big with Aetna. But that's not that's a vertical integration rather than horizontal.
So Sandra, let's stay at the level of large organizations coming together. We'll talk a bit later on about private equity roll-ups of certain smaller practices. But for hospital groups coming together, one acquiring another, coming together in partnership, what is the value proposition there? And again, does it deliver on that value proposition?
I think a number of the comments that Ken made around scale are applicable on the provider side. So if you think about what it takes to actually deliver the care to patients, you can think about things in areas combining to enhance the efficiencies and the outcomes of things like supply chain. Someone in this audience knows research can be better, right? If in fact there's more in order to feed that particular line of that business. So certainly that area of focus relative to combinations makes sense. And again, when you're talking about margins being as thin, every component of the delivery, whether that's the ability to manage your supply chain differently, whether it's more efficiencies in the way credentialing and back office activities inside a system works, that's all going to inure to the benefit of the organization that then, in many cases, can turn around and deploy that in the clinical care, which is where we all would want it to be. So that is clearly a reason. Another reason for enhancing a catchment area is, again, for that very reason of securing the ability to work with providers who then have access to patients who will utilize the care that is provided by that particular organization. And that's an important method by which you get known as the preferred clinical provider in your area, and that can extend into more geography through some type of an affiliation. And it doesn't, as we all know, it doesn't have to be outright mergers. In healthcare space, particularly on the provider side, there are different ways to go about achieving those types of benefits.
So Sandra, you made a really helpful comment for me, at least, trying to understand this space, that oftentimes what's repeated is that healthcare is different.
Right.
It's different for a number of reasons. You mentioned the delivery is more localized, personal, and individual. So in other words, our bodies are similar, but they're different. There's a lot of knowledge differentiation between patient and providers and payers. And there's oftentimes a lack of price transparency at the point of sale.
Right.
So if I'm looking at how those differences shape where value is created or not in the context of providers coming together or merging together, how do those things, or do those things make a difference?
I think they make a difference in terms of how one goes about evaluating the opportunity, and frankly, in how the opportunity is executed. We're talking about healthcare, which is the most deeply personal thing that any of us experience. This is not about buying a book. This is not about, that doesn't really matter to you where that book came from, as long as you get the book, whether it was sourced out of Indiana or California or Missouri. But I dare say where you get your health care and from whom you get your health care, it makes a difference. So it's very local in that respect, very personal, but it is also ubiquitous because everyone needs it and wants it. And so I think just the lens through which the evaluation of an opportunity is made is different than sort of a standard bread and butter M&A or just a back office play, all right? Because you are dealing with the lives of people. And the point I'm making there too is that there is a knowledge imbalance. You know, other than those of you who are physicians who have specific areas of specialty in the clinical space, most of us don't know what we don't know. I can evaluate whether I liked the book, right? But I can't evaluate per se how good is this particular provider in this particular area in a systemic way. So there's a knowledge gap about what should happen, what can happen, how will it go about happening. And that's why you see a lot of people, you know, getting their information on Google, God forbid. But it is a source. And as you look at opportunities to bring organizations together, to augment organizations, you're looking for opportunities to mitigate some of these deltas, these disparities.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, so Sandra, I think, brings up a super important point about, you know, one question I didn't answer for you was, did it work? How do these things?
I was going to get back to this one.
Okay, okay, I didn't sneak through, right? Well, so when I was an EMBA, I learned that the vast majority, 80%, maybe higher, of M&A activity destroys value rather than creates value, right? And the number one reason that generally happens is cultural, right? And that is exactly what I pretty much saw, is that the vast majority of M&A activity over the years on paper would often look great and in practice did not work half as great. And I personally think that the point about healthcare being different, I think we can all agree it's very different. And a big part of that difference is the emotion and the stakes. So no sane person would ever trade their health for any monetary value, right? It is our most precious commodity. And because of that, it evokes very significant passion. And so when you're talking about M&A activity in just pure business issues, ventures outside of healthcare, those culturally are very difficult to mesh. Imagine how hard it is when healthcare is on the line. And that's what I saw a lot. I saw some significant differences in culture, and the payer side is always thought of as the dark side. It's about the money, but it's really not. The payer side is about the mission just as much as the provider side. That was one of the big epiphanies I had coming from the provider side. And that mission can be interpreted in a whole different way from one company to another, and it really becomes kind of a nidus for cultural wars to happen really quickly. And that made integrations extremely difficult.
So Sandra, same follow-up question that Ken got to as well. If you think about, imagine 100 integrations happen across provider systems, they're all making a case around value add. How many of those actually create value, or how would we actually measure value created in those types of deals?
Two different questions. I do think, you know, in the provider space, it's when you're looking at organizations coming together that are large organizations, they are going to have some of the same, exact same questions or comments about the cultural fit. It's a people business. It's all businesses are people businesses. But when you're talking about not only sort of the we'll call them the suits versus the white coats, right? You've got situations where if the business components of culture are not aligned, there's no way it's going to work. But in this particular situation, you could theoretically envision a situation where you're going to have the business folks who say, this is going to work. We have similar mission, values, we're on a trajectory. This is how we think about the future of healthcare. But if in fact the lead providers, the lead clinicians are not of that same mind, if they are not cohesive in their thinking about what creates value in a healthcare organization, it will not work. It just, because that is your delivery, right? The clinicians are those who are delivering the good to all of us. And so it adds, I guess, Peter, from my standpoint, it adds that level of complexity around a potential transaction or an agreement or an affiliation that may not exist, at least to the same degree as in other transactions. And so I think there's more sophistication and more sensitivity in the healthcare space, which is why you look at the Berkshire Hathaways and these organizations who said, we're going to come in and we're going to fix healthcare. And 3 years later, they don't exist. So there's just some very basic fundamental things that if you don't understand it, if you don't live it, and you don't take it seriously, I think would be the downfall of any transaction.
So I think another thing that Sandra said deserves emphasis, and that is in healthcare, to really get it right, you have to have good synergy between the suits and the people who wear white coats. And that's really rare. I have a lecture about the differences between the payer side and provider side. I had the privilege of being in the leadership role on the provider side and the payer side, and it was pretty enlightening to see both sides, and not only that, but the perception they have of each other, which is really off base. But what thing is common on both sides is the suits don't understand the white coats, and the white coats don't understand the suits on either side, the payer or the providers, and it causes a lot of problems for healthcare. A lot of problems, and we need to be able to have a lot better communication, empathy, and understanding what really works in healthcare. That it's not just a business. You can't just think about it as numbers and about money and like a normal business. And that if you're a clinician, you can't think about it as just the money doesn't matter. It's just about the mission. Well, there is no mission without margin, right? And so there's a lot of misunderstanding that needs to be fixed on both sides, and it is a major part of why M&A activity, integrations, and stuff don't work.
So I want to stick with this point, and just so everyone's aware, we'll probably go another 15 minutes of us chatting, but I'd really love to get you all to weigh in on some questions that are top of mind for you. And if they're bad questions, I will just shut you down really quickly. I'm sorry, we can't hear you up here. Let's go to the next question. Darlene. Just kidding, Darlene. So I want to double click on this suits in white coat piece. This is why I wore a white suit here today to bridge the gap. But you come from different parts of that divide, the two of you. So Sandra, you came more from the business accounting side before you came in, and then had to kind of upskill and knowledge build and capability build on the healthcare side.
Recognize the errors of my ways.
Turn your suit a little bit whiter in that way.
Right.
And Ken, kind of the opposite transition, starting from the white coat side and transitioning to being a corporate junkie that just extracts value from patients.
I wouldn't say corporate junkie.
But I want to stay with these two pieces, and in particular, what I'm curious about is what was the most critical piece of the learning journey that was required in that transition, and if you were to take someone who's wanting to make that transition. So, for example, I'll have students that are traditional MBAs that want to get into healthcare venture capital or private equity or something. And we have a lot in the EMBA program that are doctors at WashU, some of them, that are looking to kind of develop kind of more the suit mentality. What are the experiences or learnings or syllabi, the things they should be reading to upskill when it comes to the other side of the house? So that was probably a 17-part question, but I'll
Right.
frame it again, right? What was the most critical part of your respective learning journey? And if you were to encourage someone from your side to accelerate that in their own life, what would you prescribe, to stay with our medical language?
I'll start. One of the early learnings that I had, Peter, in understanding a bit better about what goes on in the clinical side of the healthcare, other than being a patient personally, when I was at Right Choice, which was the publicly traded company. I was president of that company. It was a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan here in Missouri, and we had done acquisitions. But one of the things we had started embarking on in the early 2000s was to create pay for performance programs for primary care, because it was, believed at the time, and I think is still relative today, that the primary care physician is a key central component of how care gets delivered, and the relationship with the patient in a perfect world is centered in that space. The idea of actually engaging with physicians at that time, being on the payer side, sort of the suits, if you will, engaging with physicians to undertake the development of a program that would pay them for performance. We didn't even understand what performance meant. Performance of what? What are we measuring? And why is that important to you? It's not important to me. That's not what's important to my patient. I mean, just even trying to design something that engaged with the physicians, that made any sense at all about metrics and the information needed to do it, much less the workflow to gather such information. We were, you kind of start with a very high ideal of what pay for performance, and we all kind of know, we say it all the time, that's how we manage our employees, pay for performance. But the reality is, without sort of a common framework, a common understanding of how that deliverable happens and what's important to the various constituents, and if you ask me as a patient what I think performance is, and you ask the doctor, and you ask the CFO, you are likely to get 3 different answers. So that was an early learning. We thought this program would be up and running, we'd be saving all kinds of money, we'd be dropping that extra 1% to the bottom line so we didn't have to go raise more capital. No, I mean, it was slogging for 5 years before we even got a program design that was reasonably approachable, to get a provider, leader of a group to say, yes, we'll actually spend time with you on it. So that was very early, and and healthcare only gets more complicated. We do more and more exciting things in healthcare every day. Our clinicians can do amazing things. It doesn't make things get less expensive. It makes them get more expensive. So you're constantly chasing the economics on that. So that was early learnings.
Yep. So let me just double click on that piece, because I think that's helpful. Is it that the person that's coming from the suit side needs to understand with nuance how to measure things the right way, and understand the culture of how the provider has a level or desire for independence? What in particular were the lessons over that 5 years?
Yeah, just as an example, if you think about, if I'm on the payer side and I'm thinking about how to manage that capitated dollar that I have to spend a certain amount within my budget, right? That's how much I have to spend. And so there are metrics around that, medical loss ratio and so forth. So I'm trying to manage that performance. That doesn't really mean anything to the doctor per se. The doctor's not the one working within a budget. So if you really want to understand what drives those underlying components, you need to understand how costs become incurred. And the way costs become incurred back in the day was by the flick of a pen. Today it's a click of a mouse, right? So who has the power to incur the costs? It's generally the physician. And so you need to understand what drives and necessitates the decisions that a clinician is making, that then creates the cost structure that then has to get covered by this budget that somebody else negotiated. And without a clear understanding, just in that little example of how that flows, you're likely to be, sort of speaking at cross purposes.
Yeah. Okay, and flip side, so coming from the clinician side, then moving into institutional leadership, and eventually onto the payer side at leadership there, what were the lessons learned on that transition from, again, clinician to suit?
Yeah, well, so first of all, the disclaimer, I don't think I get how to make that communication great, but one of the things that I think is out there a lot is physicians saying the suits just don't get it. And the suits saying the same thing about the physicians. And of course, I heard a lot of that, both on the provider side and the payer side. And the first step is for all of us individually in this situation to say, if they don't get it, it's our responsibility to communicate in a way or really try to do whatever you can so they do get it. Because everybody wants to get it. It's not like somebody wants to not have empathy and understand what's really important to take care of people. It's just that there hasn't been enough effort. There's been more they don't get it, and then not try. And so there's a lot of that. I think on the physician side, physicians tend to have been the people who got super good grades in school. They're really successful at most things they've done in their life. They just think they can just go and be successful at something they've never had experience in. And like leadership, I was told when I came to Centene that physicians are among the worst managers of people that they are as a group. And guess what? They are. They absolutely are. They are horrible managers.
Not you all, just others that are.
Not you all.
And the biggest reason, in my opinion, why I saw that was how are they going to be good when they're in the environment of people who that's all they thought about their whole lives. They read about leadership. They go to school, get MBAs. They study. They practice it every day because the whole world is teams and competing with teams, not competing as individuals. Doctors really compete as individuals for the most part till very late in their careers, if at all. And yet they think they can just go out and just be as good at that without ever reading or studying about it and really getting the necessary experience in it. So I think some humility in these things and really an eagerness to widen your scope of understanding is critical. I was in a situation where I needed an SVP of medical management to really help with a lot of the operational things I was responsible for at Centene. And I was having a hard time finding this person. It's traditionally somebody from the clinical side, traditionally a nurse. I was looking at both nurse and physicians for this. Couldn't find a really good person, and so my CEO, Michael Neidorf, suggested I take this person from McKinsey as a 6-month interim person to just kind of help bridge the gap so I can really spend the time I need to find somebody good. It's a young person, not clinical at all, who is going to be my SVP of medical management. I immediately said, this person's not even clinical. How could they run a clinical operations? And but he said, just give it a chance, meet the person. I met this person and I was immediately impressed. I said, I want this person. And he came on and he just said, what does success look like in 6 months? Tell me what you need to be done. And I gave him some parameters, and he made it his mission in life in 6 months that at the end of it, these things would happen. This amount of savings would happen. This program would be done in operation, all this stuff. Man, did I learn a lot. I learned so much just by watching this person work. And it was really eye-opening. And so I really started thinking about getting non-clinicians for clinical operational leadership positions because they knew how to get things done. They knew how to cross the finish line, blah, 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 blah. As long as they had the right empathy and communication skills with clinicians, it was pretty enlightening. So I don't know if enough of that happens where you just say, maybe we're not as good about it as we think. We need to understand the other side more. And there's a lot of examples on the business side where they really don't think the physicians get it. And the biggest part of that is data. They take clinical data and they think it's just like business data and don't understand that there's tremendous biases, confounding factors, all these things that make a conclusion become 180 degrees different than what it was. And they run with the original conclusion all to the detriment of the healthcare business. So, I mean, there's a lot of examples where there just needs to be more empathy, more humility, more understanding, more reaching out to do that. So I don't have a solution. I need to learn a lot more, but those are kind of my first steps.
Yeah, Peter, I have to say, because it's interesting when you're on the management side and then you're working to recruit clinicians who are good leaders, Ken, and you said it's hard, and people would say, well, what's some of the most memorable sort of mistakes you've ever made, like in your career? I'd say the most memorable, many of us have hiring mistakes as most memorable, right? Or maintenance of certain individuals in certain positions, and both of mine, that's the case, and they were both physicians. And you learn a lot about how to assess leadership by not getting it right the first couple of times. But when you find them, and when you find that leader who's both clinical and savvy in the business, they've taken the time to really make that investment, they can make a healthcare organization sing and really soar. And if you're thinking about that either from an integration standpoint or an evaluation of opportunities or new programs that are coming out, having those kind of clinical leaders are sort of worth their weight in gold. It's huge. And I'll remember when I was going through EMBA, so I commend the idea of the MD, EMBA kind of idea. I had one gentleman in my class, my cohort, who was a physician, and talking about humility, he was very humble. He was in awe of what he didn't know. He promised me that if I got him through accounting, he'd get me through chemistry. And I said, I don't think we have chemistry. And he goes, well, I'm done then, right? But
good negotiator.
Good negotiator. But I think that's part of what, what can make things successful is finding that kind of leader, which hopefully is not so rare anymore.
I just would add one thing. Is there a mix of physicians and suits here in healthcare? So one of the other things I think that's important is don't be afraid to stay in your lane. Okay, so my number one, I felt, responsibility as a chief medical officer was not to tell the suits how to run clinical operations. I thought it was to be the moral conscious of the company, to make sure that we always had the safety and health of our members as our number one priority, no matter what the business consequences. And it was an easy sell at Centene. I would make sure that you're so business oriented that everybody actually has that orientation, but sometimes you lose it a little bit. And it was that chief medical officer's responsibility to do that. And on the other hand, I wasn't looking for a clinician to run a very specific operation. I didn't think that it was likely that person to be as good at it as a business person. So, part of it is understanding that there's things that as a clinician, you may be a lot better than a non-clinician about, and things that you may be a lot worse at.
So I want to end my section before opening it up with 3, maybe 4 rapid fire questions, lightning round. And this means 60-second response, 90-second response.
Good
I
luck
did not
with
prep
that.
them for this. It means I cut them off as soon as they hit that amount. But I want to hit a few final pieces just to be able to think about the value case here. So first one, Ken, we were having the conversation beforehand and you said, and I quote, about 30% of healthcare activity adds no value to the customer, and a lot of that is tied towards fraud, waste, and abuse on the provider side. So, what's the role of a sophisticated investor in changing those types of outcomes?
I
30, 29, 28.
I don't think an investor really has a huge role in that, other than to understand that the best healthcare is always most cost effective, and the two are not in conflict with each other. They actually are very much aligned.
2, 1, 0. Perfect timing. So Sandra, can you meet that number right here? So follow-up question, Sandra, when we were talking, you talked about that there's a lot of discussion about the inefficiencies in healthcare, but some of those, and I quote, inefficiencies are there on purpose. So what did you mean by this, and how might it approach how a provider or payer, private equity group approaches their own investment approach?
I'm going to answer that by asking you, how many times are you asked your name and your date of birth when you go for service? Is that efficient? Well, there's a reason for it, because the consequences of being wrong outweigh the inefficiency. If you look at it black and white, you'd say, we're going to only ask that question one time. We've been there, we've done that, and we got the results we got. So there are certain intrinsic inefficiencies built into the system that are there for a reason. And if you attempt to remove those, if you don't know the difference, you're going to have significantly worse results than you can imagine.
2 more. Sandra, I'm going to stay with you on this one. We discussed briefly in our lead up private equity roll-ups in healthcare. And one of the strategies that's being criticized at times in this space is the approach of nudging your patients towards higher margin treatment options. So in other words, I'm not going to listen to your chest, I might have an X-ray, or crowns versus fillings or other things there. Now, this happens at a lot of roll-ups. It happens if you have a private equity roll-up of an auto mechanic. So why do we find this unacceptable in healthcare, and should we?
So we do find it, I think, many people find that distasteful to think that the motivation for what's being recommended, what you might undergo, is financially motivated as opposed to in your absolute best interest. Ken said earlier, the best healthcare is the most cost effective. And the most cost effective needs to be total cost, right? Total cost on and impact on your life, your quality of life, your financials, the side effects, total cost, and it's not just math. So that is distasteful. Whereas, and again, I'm going to go back to ramifications. If you're talking about your car mechanic who is going to replace the carburetor but really could have just fixed it, you aren't going to likely suffer irreparable harm. But if what you need, is an X-ray and you get a PET scan and that was not what you needed, there are consequences of that go far beyond something. So I think we're looking for organizations and providers who have that mission focused and recognize that that needs to be a core value. And in the long run, that is what's going to make value. Short run, certainly you can get short run gains doing, pushing certain types of procedures and so forth. But I think the history is replete with situations where that has come home to roost.
One follow-up question, and Ken will finish with one final one here. So is that an externality that should be addressed through regulation, and or should it be addressed through, let's say, the organization having a different investment thesis? So in other words, I'm not going to invest for 4-year time horizons as a PE group. I'm going to think 7 years or 10 years or 15, or we need to make sure that we have a CMO who's the soul of the organization internal to our group. Is this a regulation issue? Is it an investment thesis issue? Some combination of the two?
Yeah, some of it is already regulated. There are certain regulations already around self-dealing, the quote-unquote self-dealing, right? So, who owns what Can the provider own the hospital, and those types of things. So some of it is trying to address that through regulation. But then, there's the less obvious things. And I do think from an investor standpoint, again, I think it's same with any other type of investment thesis. You are looking for high quality, moral people, right? If you're going to invest in a team, you want them to be the people who do the right thing, even in difficult circumstances, because in the long run, and even if that's a 3-year or 5-year, it doesn't take that long for things to blow up, especially in healthcare. So I think, that investment thesis is you just don't go down a certain pathway at all costs. You really do have to evaluate the people who are going to ultimately make those day-to-day decisions and make sure they're doing so with the right guidelines and core value.
Ken, last lightning round question, and then we'll open up to the group here. Right now in healthcare, in the US at least, 80% or so is fee for service. And therefore, as a result, a lot of the strategies of investment are built around a certain thesis of how you create value in that world. If it was flipped in this country, 20% fee for service and a significant more percent value, how would the investment theses, approaches, ways to create value change?
Oh, it'd be dramatically different. And I do think that we're really headed that way right now. I mean, basically, in the United States, if you get paid per service, that's your incentive. So one of the things that you want is more disease, actually. The consequence of a failed surgery is you get to operate again and make more money right now. I mean, it's absurd. And one really humongous consequence in the United States is the lack of preventative care. Okay, there's not a whole lot of interest in that at all. Payers really are interested. They can't get providers to get very interested in it at all, because that would just reduce volume. And I learned in business school that $1 used to prevent a problem equals $100 to take care of the problem, right? And maybe in healthcare it's even worse than that. So it would be, you could just go on, but the consequence of that would be better quality care for the United States and lower costs, much lower costs. The United States spends twice as much as the next most expensive country, Germany, and 3 times more than the average modern industrialized country. And among the top 30 or so countries, it ranks around 30, maybe a little bit more than 1 or 2 from the bottom, but it's one of the worst healthcares in the United States among industrialized countries. And we're paying a lot for that. So that would be the way that we would flip that around for sure, in my mind.
I love ending on a really dark note right there. So I'm hopeful that some of the questions will pull out some of the lightness. We're going to go maybe about 7 or 8 minutes, so a few questions here, and then there'll be some time to mingle afterwards and do some one-on-one. But let's see what questions you all have. Please.
Hi. I wanted to just follow on the dark thought for a minute. I'm really sorry. But I've done a lot of recruitment all over the world, bringing up healthcare systems. And one of the things that is always startlingly different is the cost, the compensation structure for physicians. So I would be really interested to hear from both of you, if we nullified the cost of medical education in this country and made that free, and fundamentally lowered the salaries and the incentives, as you said, the great, I get to do this again, and I may have or may not have made a mistake, but either way, I'm getting paid for another procedure. Do you think that would have impact, and how would that change the value stream of healthcare?
We've got a moderator for the next event. That's a much better question than I would have had. That's great.
But I mean, I could give that a little a quickie there. It's I don't think you need to pay physicians less. I would naturally say that. I think you need to pay them similar amount for quality, not for volume. And they're really ready to do that, because physician burnout's a pretty big problem. If you expected to do more and more every year for the same amount of income, there's going to be a point where you just cross that line, and most physicians have already crossed it, really. The only thing that's really keeping physicians from jumping into value is change costs. That's what I think we need to really address is it'll take a lot of money to go from volume to value. You know, there's a whole different culture that needs to be instituted, a whole different way of data gathering, all the stuff that needs to happen. Payers actually are invested to do that. The government needs to help, et cetera. But, you know, physician burnout's huge. And if you ask any physician, what is their most precious commodity? It's not money, it's time, right? So you just you can't milk too much more out of that stone. I think that the structure should, if you tell a physician you can make the same amount as you did last year, but have to work much less and just keep people healthy, you're much more satisfied with your job, and you got free time for, you know, families and everything else. And that's plenty of incentive.
So I think that it's fundamentally different, Christine, and the idea, and we see it in practice, with those provider groups or components of groups that have moved into sort of value-based as opposed to strict fee-for-service. You see that where they being the providers of care, are much more interested in understanding the systemic capability of keeping people healthy or out of their office, or using a hospitalist in the hospital. Sometimes we all have to go horizontal, right? We get pretty sick. But finding ways in order to do better work. The physicians I know all want the best possible outcome for their patient. That's why they got into this in the first place. They don't want to have to do more. They want to do less and have better results. Less meaning less procedures, or less visits, or less drugs, or whatever the case might be. But I think we are in a systemic challenge in this place where we're trying to turn that tide to be not so much of the volume. I think the generation, hopefully, of the medical students and so forth coming out of institutions like WashU and others will move us faster along, because some of this is generational. We have to get past that. And they have to have a different education. They have to have a different sort of view of the world. And they have already, we know this, different expectations relative to their own personal quality of life. We already know that for every physician that retires, we have to hire 1.3. That's probably not going to get any better in the short term.
Thank you for guys coming tonight. I really appreciate the insight that you guys provided. This is more of a curiosity question. And so I want to get both of your takes, both from a physician perspective and then a provider perspective. Payer perspective. What is the current barometer of where just healthcare is, and both of those perspectives, like again, from the payer perspective and then the physician perspective, and then what trajectory that barometer is going?
And barometer in particular around performance barometer, if you were to kind of like everything, holistic barometer, payer provider, where is it at, where is it going?
Socioeconomic stuff, access, M&A stuff, all of it's
Wow.
Yeah.
15 seconds. Okay.
I do, you know, we've been talking about a shift from volume to value since I was a medical student, and I hate to say it, but that was a long, long time ago. And I don't think people have ever believed that it will actually happen, because it just hasn't, but now I think it actually will. And I think one of the biggest impetus is what I talked about the burnout issue, and it's just gotten to a boiling point. And then there's a bunch of nudge things going on, like regulations and how physicians are being compensated and what's expected of that from Medicare, for instance. And then the other thing is growing examples on the business side where it's really been successful. Fully integrated systems which are really value-oriented, like Kaiser, Intermountain, Geisinger, which is now part of Kaiser. I mean, these are very successful systems with 5-star ratings, and very good outcome and happy physicians. They are now recruiting the highest level physicians. So it really looks like that is how we're shifting. The other thing we haven't talked about, but I would say that generative AI is making a huge difference. For the first time in healthcare, we're actually seeing some scale at all the way to the physician patient relationship, which has been the anchor in the past. So in other words, the number of patients I see in clinic is very similar to a doctor 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Number of patients I operate on is maybe twice as much as 50 years ago. So it's been very anchored there, and there's a lot of things happening technology-wise that may allow us to scale. We're not going to see the type of reduction in cost of computers and stuff and televisions and stuff like that, but at least something in the future. So in a nutshell.
Yeah, the other add, well said, and I'd add to that is, if you think about barometers, one of the things that I like to remind us to look at is demographics. So the bolus of demographics changed over the last the baby boomer era, if you will. Who's moving into that high consumption period? What are their expectations? As goes, in healthcare anyway, as goes CMS, Medicare, Medicaid, as that goes, the rest of the industry follows. It is the 800-pound gorilla as it relates to where we spend our healthcare dollars, the voting block associated with that demographic. And we're now seeing that, proportionately more and more seniors are going into Medicare Advantage, which is theoretically a more value-based plan than traditional Medicare. It's still there, but we're now seeing that happen in real time. And 12, 15 years ago, people thought that MA was just a fluke, right? Nothing was going to happen. So I do think one of the barometers is to watch how the demographics are flowing, both in terms of who the consumer of healthcare is and the demographics around who the providers of healthcare are these days and in the future.
Let's go with one more question, and then we'll have some time to mingle afterwards as well. So if you didn't get your question answered, there's an opportunity.
So, Scott Turner, class 12, 1996, 100 years ago, EMBA.
Trailing Sandra.
Watch
just
it.
by a few.
Been in healthcare now for about 20 years. My question is through the lens of the dark side, and that is...
I told you this is the last question. You're ending with the dark side.
We're going to hit it this way, but it's through the lens of the investment thesis for a moment. How do you describe exactly how United Healthcare fits, given that they're the largest employer of physicians?
Fits in the future healthcare?
More around how value is created in the industry as a result of their model.
Yeah, I don't know. My understanding of United is that their emphasis is at the primary care internist level. So it is, and they think that is going to be the way they can control costs the most, and that may happen. Whether or not they can be successful at it in their present model really remains to be seen. The historical look at it would not be promising, because including their own history with physician relationships, because they culturally really misread that type of relationship. So my understanding of United is that they are very business oriented. They look at healthcare with a very strong business lens, and that's what got them to not be as successful with when they tried to break out physician groups in the past. And unless they change that significantly, I personally wouldn't see them being as successful. And CVS is doing it, other places, and they're all having troubles with it. And it's a pretty significant cultural clash to do it. And unless you have physicians and clinical side on board, it's not going to work. So that would be my own very uneducated probably dangerous look at it. Yeah.
Well, Sandra and Ken, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your willingness to fly in, drive in, respectively, in order to spend some time with you. But I want to thank you both for your insights.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I am going to end with one final announcement that I'm not taking the lead on, but Helga and Chris are going to come up talking about ways that we can continue these kind of engagements with alum and current students and various different programs at WashU.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Yamaguchi and Sandra. This was awesome. So in line with this discussion, Chris and I wanted to announce you a new group that we want to put together. It's called OPEN. It's All-In Physician Executive Network. We think that MD MBA group is growing every year more and more. We just graduated 3 months ago. And we cannot stop going, so we keep on rolling. We want to do more. The idea is to get together, discuss challenges in healthcare, and see if we can contribute more. Also, whenever a physician graduates from MBA program, there's always some kind of pivoting in career or just change in ways of doing. So we want to discuss, we want to get together and see if we can help each other. And again, if we can make a bigger impact in healthcare in terms of quality, in terms of changes that Dr. Yamaguchi was mentioning, has to happen. So we will be announcing this group very soon in social media, All-In Business School social media profiles and website. And also, we'll free to reach out, find your contacts, reach out, and please feel free to join, to contribute as much active as you want, and make it more successful. Chris.
Yeah, you kind of said everything, but this really came out of a conversation that we had of, wow, we just got our brand shiny new MBAs. This is so cool. How much of this knowledge that we now have is perishable, and we need to keep talking about it. And especially as physicians and the amount of physicians we had in cohort 57, we're like, how can we keep moving this forward? Keep a presence at the business school, keep the contacts going, and keep events like this going too, which was fantastic. So,
Great. Well, thanks to you both.
Thank you very much.
And I do have one final thing. So there's a hope for a photo of our executive MBA alum and current students with our speakers and panelists. So if you're not that, get out of here, get some drinks outside there. But if you are that, we'd love to be able to pull you up here for a short photo. But once again, I want to thank the two of you for a fantastic conversation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Come on up here, you alum.